Welcome to Roots Rishte, a podcast focused on all things South Asian mental health.
We are your co-hosts, two psychologists in the field who are also work besties, wanting to invite you to join us as we speak about patterns and dynamics we see in our clinical work.
We want to have the serious conversations, the topics which are taboo and whispered about, but we also want to celebrate the joys and wins that we experience on a daily basis.
There will be practical applications we hope you can implement in your day-to-day life, which is not like your typical auntie's advice. And just a quick disclaimer, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute as a therapeutic relationship or therapeutic advice. Should you want to work with us, please reach out.
Welcome to Roots Rishte podcast.
I'm Dr. Ambreen Basria.
I'm Dr. Simrat Kaur Padda.
And today we're actually going to be talking about the roots of Southeast Asian mental health, right? And what and why is this a taboo topic?
Yeah. And when we talk about roots, what we're talking about really is sort of our family of origin, right? And not even in like generational sort of origins and just how deep rooted a lot of what we're going to talk about today is. Yeah. And context matters, right? And so we're talking about this from a perspective of living in the Western world, but keeping in mind that, you know, at least for my parents, they immigrated from India, from Punjab in the 1970s. But like that's where they grew up and that's the world that they knew. And so as we're kind of talking about the roots of this, I think it's also with a real sort of understanding and compassion for everybody's life stories, right? Yeah. It's not with the intent of necessarily villainizing what we're going to be talking about today, but really sort of coming from a place of understanding and trying to understand.
And also it's kind of like looking back at the generations of sorts, right? Like for me, I kind of think about it this way, right? My grandparents were actually from India. Mm-hmm. And 1947, the partition happened between India and Pakistan, and they migrated to Pakistan, right? And then now we've got my parents who were born and raised in Pakistan, who migrated to the United States, married in California, had me in California, and here I am now part of that generational story. I've migrated to Canada, maybe not as big of a migration, but the migration is still part of our story, right? Like it's still such a rooted piece of our story and like how it passes through all of these generations. Yeah.
I don't think we've ever talked about this, but with the partition, my family was in Pakistan.
How wild.
And they moved to India. Yeah. And the stories are so just traumatic. Wild. So traumatic, right? My grandma was telling me some of the stories one day. This was, many, many years ago. She's passed now. But the amount of trauma and the amount of just challenges and the sudden uprooting and like all of these things matter and it's part of the story, right? And it's part of our story. It might not be as sort of evident in our day-to-day life, but it's part of our story. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to talk a little bit more about with the roots.
Yeah. And I think to that point too, right? Like working towards that journey of healing too, because I remember growing up in California, right? Like I'm not connected to the stories that came out of like India and Pakistan at that time. When there was war, I did not kind of connect to understanding why those wars were so powerful and impactful for people, right? Yeah. I think for a lot of us, like our healing has a lot to do with how we build community amongst each other, right? How we find support amongst each other, right? And so like, it's not to like dismiss those experiences that people have had, but it's just also trying to embed and understand how does that experience fit into the context of where we're at now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just thinking of roots when you're kind of talking about the wars and stuff, I'm thinking about 1984 and sort of the impact that year had on the Sikh population, right? And it's a very sort of deep-rooted story and experience in our Sikh story. And the way that it sort of manifests as generations progress is really sort of interesting to see.
Yeah. And I think this goes right into like that piece of how, why this is so taboo to talk about mental health in our communities, right? Like I grew up Shia Imami Ismaili Muslim. I'm still a practicing Ismaili Muslim, right? And, the one thing that I think really kind of sits with me as I think about my work in psychology and like the work that we've done within communities and our communities and all of that is really just kind of sitting with the intergenerational trauma, right? Like we have never actually given homage to the stories that have come out. And maybe we're learning to do so now, right? But there are things that I think about now where I'm like, I wish my grandparents were alive because then I could have this conversation with them of how did you survive these things? Because no one talks about it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We don't even know about half of it. Like, I
No.
don't know about you. Sorry, I don't want to assume, but I'm just kind of thinking of the origin stories, right? And like, there's so much that kind of gets lost over the generations
Yeah.
that's kind of sad to actually sort of think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what we're trying to do today also is sort of like, how does this show up in therapy? So with the
Yeah.
clients that we're sitting with, one-on-one having these conversations, what are some of the sort of patterns that we're noticing, and how do our roots and just, cultural expectations and cultural dynamics, how does all of that kind of play a role in how people are today, and also the struggles and challenges that people are experiencing today?
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly enough, like so much of this is actually relatable to our intergenerational histories too, right? Like we maybe didn't talk about those things, but I remember there was a perspective where for a little while I was like, we look at the DSM. We look at this like clear cut picture of what depression looks like, what anxiety looks like, right? And then I would go out and work in the field, and I wasn't working with Southeast Asian, but I could see how this was popping up. I'd be like, oh, yeah, okay, this is cookie cutter, right? And then we would kind of turn to the community of sorts, and no one talked about how these symptoms show up in the community,
Yeah.
right? So there's this whole perspective of like, oh, mental health doesn't exist in the community, but that's not true. It's just not true.
Yeah. 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 Because how are you noticing? How does it sort of exist in
Yeah.
in our
Yeah.
community?
Well, and I think this is where that's exactly it,
Yeah.
right? Like those aunties that that are having headaches, right? They're kind of telling, oh, my head's hurting. Oh, I
Yeah.
can't move today,
Yeah.
right?
The somatic symptoms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%, right?
Yeah.
Or the ones that are having challenges with like having to go to the bathroom all the time, their stomach
Yeah.
hurts, or they're having they can't sleep,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Chronic pain,
Chronic
right?
pain.
Even things like fibromyalgia, which has a connection to stress as well. And yeah,
Yeah.
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 So a lot of, yeah, you're right, actually. I I can think of all my ideas.
Yeah.
Who has something, right? And yeah, and I do think that that's sort of an internalized manifestation of the mental health and of the anxiety and of the depression.
And something that when I've worked in different settings, like we've always talked about trauma, anxiety, all of these things,
Yeah.
they live in the body.
Yeah.
Your body shows up, right? Like if you're not thinking of it here, your body is definitely producing the symptoms.
Yeah, yeah. That kind of goes to the idea also of sort of emotional literacy just wasn't, I don't know about you, but wasn't overly sort of emphasized in a lot of households, right? And so growing up, we didn't really talk about feelings or how you were doing or sort of checking in. Very different from how I think we're raising our children. So I have two young boys, and emotional intelligence is very much at the forefront of how we're raising them, to the point where, it gets a little bit sort of not annoying, but like my older one will kind of be like, Mama, are you sad right now? And I'm like, no, I'm not sad. Are you mad right now? No, I'm not mad. Are you this right now? And so like he's trying to label the emotions. I'm just tired. So that's kind of usually what it comes down to. But those conversations were never happening growing up, right? We're never in, like, still really aren't happening, at least with, in my family dynamic with my parents. Yeah.
I would even say, like, there were emotional expressions that were so taboo and you just didn't talk about it. Like, if, for example, if somebody got angry in your family, how much of that did you actually sit down and actually talk about? Was that an okay reaction to have when you're angry?
Yeah.
What is a better way to deal with your anger? Right? Like, how can you actually communicate that you're angry? Because the thing is anger is actually a normal emotion. Every person on this planet is allowed to feel angry.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that is a normal emotion to be felt. It's not about the anger itself. It's actually about what you do with the anger. Right? So, how many of us have had appropriate modeling of what anger should look like?
Yeah.
Right?
Or even kind of sticking on the anger. What does anger actually represent, right? And so in my work, I talk with my clients about what I call undercurrents.
Yeah.
And so it's like your anger is sort of this manifestation of whatever it is that you're feeling. But what are those undercurrents? And a lot of times those undercurrents are feeling hopeless, feeling guilt, feeling sad, feeling frustrated. It's not actually angry, but anger is just the way that they know how to express it. But to be able to understand the undercurrent is to be able to build this idea of emotional intelligence.
Right. And it's also about like this regulation of it too, right? Like, how do I regulate my emotions to a point so that I can actually identify that there is an undercurrent?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, like making the connection between the somatic symptoms, right? And so the idea that like I'm always feeling unwell, physically everything is fine. You know, you get your blood work done, you get everything checked, physically everything's ruled out. So what actually could be going on?
And I actually talk a lot about this in with my own clients too, right? Like we often think that when we're having an emotional reaction, whether it's like anxiety, whether it's anger, whether it's like any of these things, that we're going like 0 to 100 like this, right? Except that's not true.
Yeah.
Right? Like, are we looking at the buildup? Like, did we look at like I love to give the staircase example of like imagine that there's 10 steps in front of you, right? Can you actually jump to the top step from the bottom floor? No, physically impossible. And if you were at the top floor, so if you're at the worst place of your emotional response, like maybe it's anger, what happens if you jump to the bottom floor? Probably a disaster too, right? So at this point, like we have to recognize that actually our emotions are really about like a buildup.
Yeah.
Right?
And kind of even as you say that, that makes me feel like, you know, other generations, previous generations may not have had the privilege to really have this opportunity for that self-actualization, right? Like it was literally survival mode. And so whether they're going from India to Pakistan, Pakistan to India, they're coming to Canada, they're coming to the States, like it's literally survival. And how do we establish this home life? And so this is almost a privilege in a sense to be able to have the capacity and the ability for the self-actualization.
Yeah. And I even reflect on that too, right? Like when I'm thinking about my own migration journey of sorts, right? And I know like we don't really like the US to Canada is like maybe it's not as great of a leap as like India or Pakistan to like the US or Canada.
It's feeling pretty great these days.
At times. I will though say that, you know, there is so much of a difference in healing in those kind of experiences, right? Coming from a place of trauma versus coming from a place of like, I'm doing this because this is good for me.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a huge difference.
What else have you noticed when it comes to things like how the roots of the origin story impact?
I think it also has a lot to do with representation, right? So no one from the community, or like there are, like now there are, right? But in the past, very limited people maybe talked about the community experience, maybe talked about like the Southeast Asian experience, right? Like, so there wasn't representation in therapy, like even our professors, right? Like our professors, maybe I had one that came from a Southeast Asian background, right? Maybe, perhaps, right? Like, and then, you know, like really that lack of representation doesn't bring the familiarity in the conversation, right? Like that's so important. Like I was thinking about when I was part of our training is that we also have to seek therapy, right? And so when I was thinking about this, like, you know, years ago when I was looking for a therapist myself, right? I went to 3 different ones and I had a rule that I would go to at least 3 sessions each with each of them, right? And then see how I felt at the 3rd session. If there wasn't like a connection, I dropped it, right? And out of the 3 experiences, I know so many of them were like, like I was so high functioning, you know, it didn't connect for me, right? Like people didn't realize that high functioning doesn't necessarily equate to good mental health.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And sometimes like high functioning is also a symptom of like part of the taboos and the stigmas and everything that are coming out of the community, right?
Yeah. The expectations, the guilt, the shame.
Yes. All of those underlying undercurrents. Because what is underneath the high functioning, right? And so I remember I finally met a therapist that was Irani in background, right? That was it. That was a connection, right? She may not have been Southeast Asian, but she understood the family context in a way that nobody else understood it.
Yeah.
And that made a huge difference for me.
Yeah. And even within families, a lot of times, like therapy, or at least this is shifting. I think it's shifting. But it wasn't normalized. Like it was not normalized. Like we weren't seeing like parents to go to therapy or marriage counseling or any of that sort of stuff. It wasn't happening. Once again, I do think that there's a shift in the tide. I think it is becoming a lot more normalized. Still, probably there's still some stigma around it. So I did a lot of MVA work, motor vehicle accident work. And so clients would come to us for, you know, injuries or whatever related to the motor vehicle accident. And because I was practicing in Brampton, I started seeing a lot of auntiya, right? And so these are Punjabi women, probably in their 50s and their 60s, and they come to therapy because part of it was, they were kind of encouraged to be there for their motor vehicle sort of situation. But once they started talking to me, they're like, "Woman, I can talk to you about anything." And I was like, "Yeah, you can talk to me about anything." The way that those conversations shifted away from like vehicular anxiety or anything to do with driving towards like life and the depression and the anxiety and the somatic symptoms. And so it was almost like a door into therapy that they didn't even know that they like could take. And then they came and then they had this experience,
Yeah.
right? But still very hush hush. And it was still under the umbrella of NVA work.
Yeah.
But it's that like I think that just shows the need for it,
Mhm.
right? Like I
Yeah.
feel like if you sit down with Andia and you kind of say like, "Tell me your story," like they will tell you their story and they will probably well up in tears very, very quickly, and they'll probably have a lot to say. But no one asks, right? Or like it's so normalized for it to be repressed. But these opportunities, if they present themselves, I think could be healing as well.
And on that note, like it's so interesting, right? Because I think, there's this perception that we as therapists have to have solutions and answers to all of those problems. And
Mhm.
I remember this was something I struggled with
Yeah.
as a therapist, right? Like I don't always have all of the answers and I don't always have all of the solutions. But then I remember this.
Yeah.
That's actually not my job, right? Like my job is to be here as a support for you and to hear your story, to give witness
Yes.
to your story, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the thing that's the most powerful part about therapy altogether is that
Mhm.
somebody is there to bear witness to your story.
Yeah. 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 And the way that that can be healing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really, really powerful. Yeah, that reminds me of kind of I don't know if you sort of seen this post going around by Pink Ladue, and so they're an organization in the UK that is very much about celebrating girls, and particularly the birth of girls, and sort of just really normalizing and celebrating that. But there's a post that it's a very recent post, and it's the idea of like our grandmothers were like always so happy, or like you think that your grandmother was always so happy, or like she never had any issues. It's because you didn't know, right? You didn't ask. Or like it's also sort of this idea of there's this expectation that like that generation is okay and everything's fine and you're kind of able, like once again, it's a privilege to be ignorant to it. It's a privilege to not think that it's an issue. But the idea like if you sit with a grandmother and you ask for their story, the things that will come out,
Yeah.
right? The things that they will share.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And this is not really to shame us or like our generation or our community for like not asking, but it's really about raising the awareness of like, wait, we should ask,
Yeah.
right? Like we should ask because
Yeah.
the thing is that, yes, we have the privilege of like surviving through all of
Mhm,
this,
mhm.
but now we're here and we now have the privilege to ask about all of this.
Yeah, but what
This,
that also does is that also helps to break these generational patterns that we're
yeah.
talking about, right? And so if we don't talk about the lack of emotional literacy, if we don't talk about the expectation for overfunctioning, if we don't talk about the guilt and the shame and the repressed emotions, then it continues, the pattern continues,
Mhm.
right? And so by bringing air to it, by bringing light to these issues, that's how we start to change.
Exactly. So I guess like my other question for you is how else do you see it?
I think with the overfunctioning that I just mentioned,
Yeah.
yeah. So in my practice, where um, predominantly they're really well functioning females within maybe the age range of 32 to 45, I would kind of give it. But with that overfunctioning, there is a lot of guilt and there's burnout and there's high expectations. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of anxiety. And so it's almost like a difference between the external and the internal, right? So
Yeah.
externally we kind of see like, oh my God, like this person is doing so great, right? She has a family, she has kids, she's whatever, a lawyer, a doctor, and whatever it could be, right? An engineer. Oh my God, I just went so stereotypical. I just went so stereotypical.
Maybe they're an actor. Maybe they're a cook.
Yes,
Maybe something
yes.
else.
These are the patterns. Right? Like these are the patterns.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Yes, all of that, all of that. Yes, all of that. And maybe not. Maybe they're at home with their kids, which in and of itself is such an important and empowering role. And so on the outside we see one version and then they come into our work or they come into their work and we see all those undercurrents. We see everything that's underneath. And I think that's where um another way of how those roots and those expectations have manifested over time.
And, I will say, like, on that note, like, I think one of the things that's really important to sit with too is like this really Western and Eastern philosophies around some of these things, right? Like, we have some very, when we're working in therapy, there's a lot of like Western notions around like boundary setting and like, addressing some of these like perfectionistic goals or looking at it from a perspective of like, oh, you're high functioning, right? But then I think there's also all these like other philosophies that we're not looking at, like with these Eastern contexts of like how the guilt and shame and, the desire for perfectionism, how that's playing into the role, right? Like it's all these like vicious cycles of sorts. And I find that when we're like working in terms of like treatment, we really have to balance that Western and Eastern philosophy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so with all of this, what do we do with it, right? Like what's the, not your auntie's advice, like what is the advice that is coming from Ambreen and Simrat and kind of from a clinical perspective?
I think for me is what do you look for in a therapist, right? Like how do you kind of like if you're starting this like journey of looking for a therapist, starting with a therapist and stuff like that, it's that reminder that, therapy can be helpful, it can be empowering, it can be wonderful. You might think that therapy is talking about these deep, dark secrets, but I often find that I'm laughing with my clients. I'm healing with my clients, right? Like I think it's so important to have a therapist that gets what you need.
Yeah. And that's not to say that therapy is a necessity. It's not that everybody needs to go to therapy. But if you're listening to this, there is probably a curiosity about, what two psychologists have to say about South Asian mental health. And so maybe there is a curiosity or an interest in what therapy could provide. And so with that in mind, what are the things to look for? How do you find a therapist? Actually is probably the question. How do you find a therapist?
Yeah. And, we could talk about Psych Today. We could talk about Google searches. I know that's what a lot of people are doing these days, right? But ultimately, I think what I often tell people is read the bios, right? Like read the bios. What's about their bios that stand out to you, right? It's okay to shop around.
Yeah.
Expect that, right? Like expect that. Don't just make an appointment with one. Make an appointment with 2, 3, whatever it is, but kind of do the initial sessions, right? Like we can't obviously work with you if you're like established with somebody else, right?
Yeah.
But if you're just trying something out for a little while, try it out.
It's a relationship, right?
Yeah.
Like therapy is actually a relationship.
Yeah.
It's not a hierarchy. It's not an authority sort of dynamic. It's a relationship. And so connection, compassion, feeling you're in a non-judgmental sort of zone. Like those things are important. And like you said, shop around, right? Like it's okay to ask for a consultation, like a 15-minute phone call to kind of say like, how do I kind of feel about this person or what's their energy like?
And do I want to come back and talk to you again?
Yeah.
Right? Like that was a question I used to ask myself. Do I want to come back and share my story with you again? If the answer was no, then I knew, right?
Yeah. And so once again, it's not the idea that everybody needs therapy, but it's a tool and it's a support that's available.
Yes.
We are just touching like the tip of these roots. You know what I mean? Like there's so much to talk about. And so in this episode, like we just wanted to introduce you to some of the dynamics or some of the things that we've noticed. But the hope is that, as we kind of progress with these episodes, we can really start to take some deep dives into some of these topics. But roots are, they're deep.
They're deep. They're deep. Yeah. But on that note, thank you for joining us today. This is the Roots Rishte podcast.